This time on Poll Hub, we're recapping Donald Trump's first 100 days. And according to our latest poll, Americans aren't too impressed. We even asked respondents to grade him like a student. Let's just say there was a lot of red ink. Then, although we're now more than 5 years removed from the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, many of the nation's youngest citizens are still feeling the effects of the prolonged isolation. We explore why mental health among young adults continues to decline and whether there might be a silver lining. And finally, with graduation season around the corner and the anxiety that comes with it, we're rewinding back to 1939 to see how career aspirations after school looked very different back then. So stick around. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Lee Berikoff.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Hunter Petro.
I'm Neil Viswanathan.
So Donald Trump is wrapping up his first 100 days in office for the second time. And we have a new poll out with our partners, NPR and the PBS NewsHour. And just like nearly every other poll, his approval ratings are at historic lows for any modern president at this point in a term. In other words, presidents have been lower in their approval ratings, but usually they're given a bit of a honeymoon for the first 100 days. We asked a different question in addition to the approval rating, which Donald Trump scored at 42%, down a couple of points from earlier this year. And what I think was significant there as well is even though it was just a 3 percentage point drop from 45%, what also occurred was an increase in his disapproval rating. So that went from 49% to 53%. So we saw kind of a narrowed divide as to how the president was doing to an 8-point gap, which is why it's getting noticed in our poll and in others. We did ask this other question as well. We wanted to see how Americans graded the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and the plurality give his performance a failing grade, actually an F. But what I find very interesting in this, and it's not surprising, but I think still interesting, is the difference between Democrats and now independents. Should note that it's independents who have been disappointed with the current administration more so than his base. Although even among Republicans, just a slim majority, 54%, give the president a grade of an A, whereas 29% give him a B. I'm sure people think that a B is still a good grade. That does suggest a lack of, I know, Mary, you don't like Bs. You don't even like an A minus. But it does suggest a lack of enthusiasm for the direction that the administration has been going. So, Lee, perhaps you can start off with some of the things that, I don't know if you saw, you thought of anything as surprising, but are there some cautionary tales in this poll that you noted for the president?
Well, I think, one thing to note, I think just generally, and we've seen this, look, there are some criticisms of polls coming out of Washington right now, but I think without exception, every one of these national polls is about half a dozen out, to around the 100-day mark through the president. They've all been showing low numbers and lower numbers than they've had. So it is not like, these are outliers. It's the entire polling community is finding that as measuring public opinion, that the numbers have gotten weaker for the president. I think it's being driven by several factors. Issues, the things that brought him back to the White House are upside down. So is the economy, which is obviously a big deal. 39% approval, 55% disapproval. The whole tariff issue, which I think is really when things started to turn, and they've turned fairly dramatically. I think the uncertainty around the tariff, with I believe a 34% approval rating to 58% disapproval in terms of his handling of the tariff, and the link of the tariff to the economy. So the two, I think, is greater than the parts here. So things do get connected. Foreign policy, obviously, very much on people's minds as well, because of a lot of the topics that have been brought onto the table by President Trump. 39%. Notice the 30s in here a lot in terms of these issues, only in the issue of immigration, which is still upside down. he's getting a 44% approval rating, but a 52% disapproval rating. So I think that's one whole area. And I would just quickly add to that the notion that a lot of people think he's been moving too fast. And the reason he's done so much during the 100 days, the downside of that is it's very hard for him to then say, I haven't done anything and I'm just inherited Biden's economy. Because when it comes to that, we find no, people think he owns it now. And the reason he owns it is because he's been so active and in a direction that people are not necessarily comfortable with, and that he's moving really fast.
I do find it interesting, Lee, you went through a number of the specifics. But Mayor, we also asked some questions kind of giving a sense of kind of the whole, what people, the perceptions that people now have about how we're moving forward and the future direction of both the country and the economy. Perhaps you can speak to some of those numbers as well.
Sure, absolutely. And I do want to come back to one point that Lee made about tariffs. But when we take a look at how Americans describe the direction in which President Trump is moving the country, 51% believe that he is moving the country in the direction of change for the worse. Lee pointed out that many Americans, 61%, think that President Trump has been rushing to make changes without considering the impact of those actions. And that, in fact, is up from 56% in March. And then just in terms of how President Trump's policies have been affecting Americans during his second term, 49% of residents nationally say that the policies that President Trump has implemented during his second term in office have had mostly negative impact on them. 32% say they've had mostly a positive impact. And about 1 in 5, 20% say that they have not had any personal impact on them at all. But Lee, to your point about tariffs, really where the tides have turned for the president, one number that really stood out for me is that when we asked the country, do they think that placing tariffs or fees on products imported from other countries helps the U.S. economy or hurts the U.S. economy, 33% currently say that it helps the U.S. economy and 57% say that these tariffs hurt the U.S. economy. Now, that proportion who believe that this is detrimental to our economy is up from 48% just from March of this year. And what I also found interesting is that 10% believe that it doesn't make much of a difference either way, and that's down from 18%. So I really think here that Americans, as they become more attuned to the idea of what a tariff is, how they're becoming more educated about what exactly that means for the country, I think that this is becoming more problematic for the administration.
I think one of the things that was very interesting during the campaign is when we asked people their recollection about the previous Trump administration. They really saw him as someone who could turn the economy around, somebody that they recalled they had done better off financially under. And so the economy was a very significant issue for people who supported the president last November. So as we turn to now an electorate that appears to be feeling a good deal of, I should say, a great deal of disruption, particularly with the economy. And I do want to caveat that with the point that President Trump is still supported and has a very strong base. About a third of this sample are people who identify as Republicans. And for the most part, he is still very much right side up among those voters on most of these issues. I don't think he falls below a majority in support on any of these issues. But in terms of going forward and redefining the administration, particularly, and I know it's always far off and I always bring this up, but particularly given that Congress has to be getting a little itchy, with their, reelection campaigns going to be starting up. And it really starts up now in terms of fundraising. Do you think he's going to continue to get the support from the party that he has up until this point?
I think that some of the congressmen, particularly those in swing districts, are feeling a little bit of a squeeze here on the Republican side because if they don't, go along with their President Trump on and there I mean by Republican, he's not shy. There may be primaries within the party in the future if they get too outspoken. On the other hand, if they are in swing districts, they need to be very sensitive to the fact that independents are not in Trump's corner right now. And the midterm elections increasingly have been nationalized, and Donald Trump will be not on the ballot in the midterm elections, but his presence will be very much there. I wanted to also just point out one other thing that I think is underlying some of this downward direction, additionally to what we've been saying. You know, we often reference our old friend Tim Russert, who said that politics is not particularly complex. You just say you're going to do it, and then say you've done it. And that was Donald Trump's message. I mean, he was, tells it like it is. And he was, say he was going to do it and then said, yeah. And then he would say, with, sometimes pulling the facts a little bit, yeah, I've accomplished that. But now, especially in the tariff, every day there's been, it's 10%, 40%, 80%, 20%. I mean, there's been this constant, well, what are we going to do in China? What are we going to do in Europe? I mean, the best thing they can say is that it's negotiating, but that doesn't do well in public. In other words, the message has gotten cloudy for him. And I think that that's confused and gotten him off message and certainly away from the formula that he's been so successful with. But I have a bone to pick with the Colbert show. I noticed, we like publicity, and, they took the question, they referenced a lot of the recent polls, and then they took the question of whether Trump is getting a grade of A, B, C, D, or F. And they reported, not surprisingly from Colbert's perspective, that he was getting, a lot of people were saying that he was getting an F grade. And they made some kind of off-color joke about that, which I won't go into. But he didn't cite us. The word Harris did not come out of his mouth, and neither was it on the graph. So, I mean, we love to get the coverage, but we also like to be sourced when it's our numbers. So, we made national news, but it wasn't identified with Harris in this particular instance. So, thumbs down on Colbert for that.
Before we move on here, because I think there's a couple of other things here in this poll, and I do appreciate that. And we do always love when we get a shout out from, whichever side of the aisle it is. But two things. One, the Musk factor. Is that something that's going to go away? Because his numbers are pretty tough to take to in this poll. 54% of residents nationally, actually up a few notches from March again, have an unfavorable opinion of Musk. I know he has left to try to improve the standing of his companies, particularly Tesla. But is he a lasting factor here, Mary?
Wow, you're putting me on the spot for that question. I think anything with the Trump administration has the impact to be a lasting factor here. I think that for now, Elon Musk has gotten a lot of attention over the first 100 days, but it really is only 100 days into the administration. In terms of where he goes, supposedly he's not going to be a factor moving forward in the administration. Who knows? But I'm sure someone else will emerge and could become a lightning rod. But I think not just with the Trump administration, but with today's politics, we never know where we're going to go, not just from one day to the next, but really one hour, one minute to the next. So I think anything is possible.
And certainly lastly, we did throw in one question about whether or not people felt that it was important to date someone with the same political views. And not surprisingly, this was a very polarizing question. 50% said it didn't matter, and 40% said that it did. So watch out there.
Well, now let's turn to the state of mental health in the United States. The rates of poor mental health are on the rise, creating a national crisis. Among those affected are America's youth. So today we're going to break down some of the numbers and the potential causes leading to this vulnerability among America's young people. Let's start with the groundwork. According to Health Resources and Services Administration in 2023, 1 in 5 adolescents, 5.3 million, had a current diagnosed mental or behavioral health condition. This includes anxiety, 16%, depression with 8.4%, and behavioral or conduct problems, 6.3%. Now, between 2016 and 2023, the prevalence of diagnosed mental or behavioral health conditions increased 35% among adolescents. Anxiety diagnosis among adolescents saw a 61% increase, and depression diagnosis saw a 45% increase. Also from the HRSA in 2023, young women, in fact, possess higher rates of mental health disorders than young males, while males have higher rates of behavioral disorders. So now I want to bring in Neil Viswanathan, one of our student producers who put this segment together. Neil, talk to us about what's going on here. I'm guessing that COVID has a little bit to do with it.
Yeah, definitely. So over the last few years, we've done a number of segments about how COVID has impacted young people in particular. And we talked a lot about social media, and a new report from Pew has a lot of recent data on this topic. According to Pew, 48% of US teens aged 13 to 17 say that social media has had a mostly negative impact on people their age. This is up 32% from 2022. Only 11%, however, say that social media has had a mostly positive effect on people their age, which is down 24% from 2022.
And parents are more worried about social media than teens, and that's really not surprising. Among the 89% of American parents who say they are at least somewhat concerned about teen mental health, 44% say social media is the number one thing most negatively impacting teen mental health. Among the 77% of teens who say they are at least somewhat concerned, 22% say social media is number one. Now, according to a poll from NBC News in May of 2023, 95% of teens say that they use social media, with a third saying they are engaged almost constantly. Now, with my tweens, I see that they are almost always on their devices, not necessarily those social media.
It's not all doom scrolling, however. COVID has this big continuing impact. According to the CDC, while feelings of persistent sadness and hopelessness among young people had increased about 40% in the 10 years leading up to the pandemic, NYU psychology professor Kimberly Hogewood says it's certainly gotten worse during the pandemic. Additionally, a new study out of Cambridge last month found that the number of new mental disorder cases among individuals aged 5 to 24 increased by more than 11% annually during the pandemic. Further, Zara Abrams from the American Psychological Association notes that academic disruption, death, parent layoffs, and increased rates of domestic abuse have all contributed to the youth mental health decline during the pandemic. She also notes that heightened instances of mass violence, natural disasters, climate change, and political polarization of the time has also played a role in this increase in mental health diagnosis.
So, Neil, this is a segment that you pitched, and I'm just curious, given everything that the nation has been through over the last 5 or 6 years, what really spoke to you about this topic and why you thought it was important for us to talk about it today?
I thought more generally, I think we've just seen a lot broader of a discussion and a much more normalized discussion surrounding mental health. And I think it's very interesting in the diagnosis of these diseases among young people, how they're increasing so much. And I don't think that's necessarily just because it's getting worse. I think it's almost a positive thing because it means that these are being, diagnosed. And when you diagnose something, you can treat it rather than it simply going untreated. So even though a lot of these numbers might seem a little grave, I actually think there's a silver lining in a lot of these numbers, and I thought that was really interesting. Hunter also has been a teen during the pandemic. I'm wondering, do you share a similar sentiment on this?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was really interesting during the pandemic to see the way our social batteries and our generation as a whole took a change. And, going from being in a classroom and being social every day to your form of socialness is a Zoom call, sitting in your room, not face to face. And after about 2 years of that, you could definitely see how it had an impact on people. As we started to get back into the real world, people, their social batteries they're more shy. Handling those kinds of situations takes them back, in my opinion. But what is also interesting, I think, is the factor here of overdiagnosis in a way where a lot of kids in our generation are, scrolling TikTok and they're falling into all these little doom holes or, loops. And then they start to establish these sort of mental diagnoses. They didn't grow up like this. It wasn't necessarily their upbringing. It can happen within a year where, you go from you're locked in a room, your anxiety, your stress, your depression, it all can take a stark increase the less social interactions you have. So it's definitely interesting to watch that all happen amongst my friends and the groups, and being in college and high school. It's definitely interesting.
I think that there's a duality here because there are two things. I think we talked a couple weeks ago about technology and being a neo-Luddite. We joked with Lee about can you deal with not being on your device for a certain period of time? Would you be able to handle that? I think that there are a couple things from a parental perspective in terms of these mental diagnoses, that there's the technology part of it, and then there's the social media part of it. So, as a parent, you worry about your kids being on the devices, worrying about, are they isolating themselves? Are they not becoming as socialized as perhaps that they should? And then there's the aspect of social media and the interaction on social media and the bullying, which again is not new or not just solely associated with the pandemic. But I think that young people were on their accounts so much, and because they had no other means necessarily. But the concern has become greater. I mean, like everyone knows I have early adolescent children. And one of my oldest friends was being body shamed by one of her friends that her mom had found out about. And so there are these things that really lead to negative self-images that caused depression and anxiety down the road. But Lee and Barb, I'm wondering, are you surprised by any of these statistics?
Well, I think this is really interesting. I think that this generation is facing so many more challenges than we have seen in the past. Not to say anybody has, life is tough, so it's not that anybody has had it easy. But if you think back even over the last 100 years, I mean, we can point to the generation of the Depression, which, was defined by that economic collapse. We talk about the greatest generation, who was defined by World War II. But I think that this generation, I mean, we started out talking about mass violence and guns in schools and how to deal with that. And then we walk into a pandemic and all the challenges that involved and all the disruptions. And now you have enormous economic disruption where we are transitioning again in terms of this economy, which again causes direct family issues and concerns as parents maybe getting laid off or needing to change careers and changing jobs. So I think that this generation in particular has faced a combination of challenges that we haven't seen in a very long time. And I want to kind of emphasize what Neil said. It's really important to be talking about these things. And I would agree that these numbers probably are real in that because of the challenges this generation has had to experience, that there is a growing issues of depression and anxiety and a whole host of other disorders. But I like the fact that, Neil, you talk about these things as a disease and something that can be handled and dealt with. And that's a very, very different mindset than I think Lee and I would have grown up with and experienced, in high school and college. You didn't talk about these things. And I think the fact that there is greater discussion is very important. Social media is an issue that can help and hurt when it comes to this by both allowing people to identify issues that they may be feeling and then not feeling that they're alone, but then obviously exacerbating others. But the conversation, I think, is very important. And I think that these numbers do show that people are not alone and that we do need to take steps to support people in these times.
Yeah, I would just add to that or embellish that. I find the modes of communication among everybody, but especially among the younger generation, can be both a source of connection and also can be isolating. So both of those paths lead to very different conclusions. On the COVID topic, which clearly had a huge impact on folks during those developmental years, had a huge impact on everybody. Some people more for health reasons, others for social interaction reasons. And I think that differed with generations. But I think I saw two very different reactions among younger people to COVID, and both were not necessarily great. Some people said, boy, you can really get financially wiped out with, a change in the economy and how that can impact things. And those individuals, those young people then sort of doubled down on career focus. I better get some, money put away and for the rainy day, because you never know when something like this might occur or something else again. And other people sort of say, well, you just don't know what's going to happen down the road, and I better live it up now and have a good time. And so I saw young people going in two different directions, both for uncertainty, because if you don't know what your career path is, that's a little anxiety producing. And also, if you do think you want to double down on a focused, narrow career path, the economy doesn't necessarily provide a easy way into that. Entrance is high. So I think that in both instances, the uncertainty in life got magnified during that period for everybody. And I don't think there's comfort in the fact that, we've solved these kinds of issues, and that the idea that maybe things will be recurring of some sort in the future leaves people walking on quicksand a little bit.
Lee, you bring up career paths, and I think that that's the perfect entree to a lighter topic for your fun fact this week.
Well, funny you should mention that. So we go all the way back to 1939. A Roper youth poll found a wide variety of answers to the question, what kind of work do you want to do when you leave school? We're talking 1939. So there was a whole assortment. The number one answer, which I suspect you wouldn't get today, was with 15% office workers, stenographers, secretary, clerical work. That was the aspiration of 15%. The next highest at 8% were nurses, 8% were aviators, 7% teachers, 7% engineers, and a whole bunch of things, including 1% at a civil service job, Army, Navy, 2%, salaried executive, 1%. I mean, hey, I think some of us, our youth here, would probably take exception to that. Owning your own business, 1%, farm or labor, 4%, lots of things. Here's one up my alley, dancer, actors, 3%, just kidding. And lots of stuff there. I'm going to go right to the younger generation here saying us senior folks have already cast their lot. Neil, how do you react to what people were saying in 1939? Is there anything in here for you?
Well, this is a bit of a sore subject because I am leaving school very soon and not exactly sure what I want to do. But I do think there's a couple of very interesting things on here. I think 8% of Americans wanting to be an aviator is very interesting. I know that this is still, planes were still relatively new within the 20, 30 years of being invented. So I guess there was that kind of craze, but I think it's interesting how twice as many Americans wanted to be aviators and laborers, which doesn't really seem productive for our society, because if we have all these pilots and not enough people to grow our food, that seems like that might be somewhat of a problem.
And today we might find astronauts rather than aviators. I can think of that. And you're still undecided in your own career path?
I am. I'm currently waiting to hear back from grad school, but yeah, I'm weighing a couple different options right now.
That's, I think, not uncommon at this point.
Actually, 8% said they didn't know. In 1939, leave school actually may have meant high school and not college, although a number of the professions here did require advanced degrees.
Yeah, before I turn to Hunter, just for the record, none of us were alive in 1939. I don't want to in any way think that I was implying something other than that. Hunter, what say you about this? You have about 8 irons in the fire right now. So are any of those down the road when you're going to opt for? You just going to keep a multi-front on this?
I guess like the civil service job would probably be the one I go with, but that's at 1%. I find it interesting how like the lawyer and doctors and more of the higher paying jobs that you see today are some of the lowest responses on that's what people wanted to do after they left school.
Yeah, but I think also we're talking during the Depression, and I think it's realistic to think that a lot of those goals would have been just out of people's reach realistically. So it's sort of like my wanting to be a center fielder for the Yankees, out of reach for other reasons. But certainly the Depression, I think, cast a shadow on where people were going to go with this. I think that might, obviously the economy was a very different economy, but that may be doing that as well. What's Hunter going to be doing 5 years from now, does he think?
Probably lobbying, honestly.
I was going to say ruling the world. You're going to be ruling the world, Hunter.
I can't start that until I turn 35, according to the Constitution. So we'll get there.
Mary, do your children talk about what they want to do when they grow up at this point? And is that a changing goal with the weeks, or are they pretty much, going down the line?
No, Mike has been pretty much set that he wants to be a police officer, NYPD, since he was probably about 3 years old, and now he's 12. And, Joseph he's going to be a Major League Baseball player. That's what he keeps telling me. So that's where we're going. And my 3-year-old wants to be a doctor. So we'll see. We'll give her some time to see if she wants to change her mind. But I think to this list, it's really interesting that there's a lot of realism here. To your point, Lee, this was 1939. There weren't a ton of opportunities available. Perhaps realistic aviator aside, Neil, I think perhaps that was more aspirational. Yeah. But I think that it was a very realistic list. And so it didn't really surprise me that 15% cited office worker or being a stenographer or secretary.
Yeah, Barb, did you still think
Well,
I don't
well,
see rock and roll singer on here?
Well, you do, musician, dancer, actor.
Okay.
Although it's funny, I'm surprised Gigi wants to be a doctor because I thought she just wanted to be boss.
Well, that is true.
You could run a hospital though, Barb. You're not, you're missing on that.
Well,
That
she's
could-
certainly the boss of me.
And I fear that may only get worse before it gets better, Mary. That is your future for sure. But that's the job. You hold multiple job titles, and mom is obviously a major one, but you certainly include a lot in your resume. But it'd be fun to see how Hunter and Neil played this out. And, the society's changing. And look at 1939. Who knew what was right around the corner? People were in the throes of the Depression, but the world changed very dramatically and was changing at that point. So we will see where we are in a few years. Do come back and visit, please.
That'll do it for Poll Hut this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Hunter Petro, and AJ Gambino.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Maris Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.